Well, good evening and welcome. I want to thank the folks that are here live in person and also say hello to those that are joining us on the live stream. For those of you that I may not have met before, I'm Eric Nordberg. I'm the Dean of the Paul Meek Library, and so glad to have people here. A little bit of housekeeping for those that are here in the room. If you haven't been in our building before, restrooms are down back over this way, and you'll also see an emergency exit sign should you need to leave the building in a hurry. If there are any students that are coming in, they have the ability to check in using a QR code back on the desk. We also have some copies of our library copies of our authors' books there. Those are all available for checkout tonight if you want to take a book with you when you leave. And a reminder that anybody with a Tennessee driver's license has the ability to get a borrower's card here at the Paul Meek Library. This building is named for Paul Meek, who was a leader on this campus for more than 30 years and did a lot of things that really led to the successful survival of this university during the Depression and through World War II. He continued in a leadership role till 1967, and so we're very fortunate to have this building named after him. But it doesn't end with him. His daughter, Dr. Ann Meek, was also a great supporter. She created a couple of different endowments here at the university and for the library, one of them named in honor of her mother, Martha Meek, which is actually a fund that we are allowed to use to buy literature for the collection, including a collection of the books by our author this evening. So we get to benefit from that. And then she doubled down by also endowing a second fund that helps to support what she named the Paul Meek Literary Legacy Speaker Series. And so each year we invite an author to come to be part of this series. On your chair there, you should be able to find a list of the authors that we've had here before, if you're not aware of those as we go. And it doesn't end there either. Ann Meek, who passed recently, has a daughter, Lisa Roney, and Lisa continues to be a supporter. I'm hopeful that she may be watching this on the live stream. Lisa is also part of our selection committee that each year chooses the author that comes to campus. The Meek family were very moved by the need that they saw over 3 generations for students to be exposed to literature. And although they were supportive of all the programs here on campus, this desire to make sure that students were engaging with literature, reading literature, and interacting with authors, I think continues to this day, and we're very fortunate to have that support as we go. Today's event also crosses a couple of other streams. The Department of English and Modern Foreign Languages held their annual Young Writers Conference today, and our speaker tonight was able to participate in that activity, talking to some students from our local junior and high school community. And then our speaker also was very nicely invited to sit in on a class that Dr. Jeff Longacre teaches and had an opportunity to interact with some of our undergraduate students talking about some of the romantic poetry of Keats. So we've had him run off his feet today to do a bunch of different things, but I think it's also part of the intention here is to try to get people to be reading, to be engaged with literature. If you haven't already done so, those of you that are here, we do have our friends from the bookstore who are happy to sell copies of some of our authors' books. So our author, you didn't come here to hear me talk about the Paul Meek Library as much as you came to hear about Simon Van Booy. A few things. I've had a chance to spend some time with him today and interact with him before he came. I think sometimes people use the word Renaissance person. I'm not sure exactly what that means. I find the word eclectic might be a better one. As I've had time to spend time with Simon today, it's a very complicated personal history that includes family elements back to Jamaica, to Ireland. There's also a scholarship to play football, American football in Kentucky, that brought him to the United States initially, but then also a Welsh coal mining town, the university city of Oxford, the country of Greece, and now New York City. So you can ask questions of him later if you want to see how the connect the dots works on that. But I think it's been a great fun talking with him. He's been in New York City now for 20 plus years, and that's his home base for the time being. He's published more than a dozen books, actually getting close to 20 now, I think, looking at the list that I saw. This includes a real strong showing of fiction, which includes novels, poetry, and short stories as well. Children's titles, a beautiful picture book about a little girl who drops her mitten in the woods and each of the animals tries to guess what it is. I thought the fish warmer was my favorite in that book. But then also he has been identified by others and acknowledged for his work through several awards. His poetry collection won the H.R. Hayes Poetry Prize. Short story collection won the Frank O'Connor Prize. He's also had his book shortlisted for several other awards by different organizations. If you haven't yet read his latest book, Sipsworth, I can highly recommend it. I think this is going to be one of my favorite books for all time. It's a wonderful story about a woman who has relocated to her childhood home at the end of her life with the expectation that she's going to live out the last few days of her life without a great deal of fanfare, and then she befriends a mouse. It's a great story with lots of twists and turns, and I can highly recommend it. It's a really wonderful, sweet story. He's also published nonfiction material, books on philosophy, lots of essays that have been published in most of the major newspapers and journals, both here and in the British Isles. He's also written a full-length stage comedy and did a movie, a short movie for a hotel chain. But wait, there's even more. During COVID, he decided that it might be useful to know how to help people who are having medical emergencies. And so he's a fully trained EMT and actually volunteers with the New York City Fire Department as a volunteer EMT, and in fact was delayed in departing New York because he was called out on a call the night before he was expecting to leave. So I don't want to overburden you. I've already done that. Maybe you can put your hands together and welcome our speaker, Simon Van Booy.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I appreciate you having me on campus. It's lovely to be here, and what a beautiful library. I feel like I know exactly where I put my bed when I move in. So thank you. And this is my latest novel, Sipsworth. And I think I'll start this evening just by reading some while everybody's here. I'll read just the opening, and then I'll talk a little bit about the book. I'm having a great time on campus, by the way. I did sit in on a wonderful lecture, and it reminded me, it really reignited my passion for romantic poetry, and I suppose that's what great teaching does. It starts a fire that never quite goes out throughout one's life. But it also reminded me of a story where, when I was a teenager, my sister went to the record shop, and she came home with this record, very excited. And the record, was in plastic, and she ripped the plastic off and disappeared into her bedroom and put the record in, put the record onto the turntable. And then, about 10 minutes later, she came out disgusted, and she was holding the record sleeve, and it said romantic music. And she said, "That's not romantic, it's bloody classical." So I'm not sure if she ever got her Barry White album, but anyway. So I'll read from the opening of the book, Overture. Helen Cartwright was old, with her life broken in ways she could not have foreseen. Walking helped, and she tried to go out every day, even when it poured. But life for her was finished. She knew that and had accepted it. Each day was an impersonation of the one before, with only a slight shuffle, as though even for death there's a cue. Not a single person who glimpsed her bony figure flapping down Westminster Crescent could say they knew her. She was simply part of a background against which their own lives rolled unceasingly on. In truth, Helen Cartwright was native to the place, born in the old Park Hospital while her father fought at sea. The hospital was long gone, but the brick cottage where Helen had grown up was still there. Now and again she walked that way into town. The front garden had been paved over, but cracks in the cement sometimes bled flowers she could name, as though just below the surface of this world, are the ones we remember, still going on. Her home now was a detached pensioner's cottage with a mustard door. She'd purchased it through the internet after living abroad for 60 years. A lot can happen in 6 decades. A place can change, but she hadn't changed. Helen realized that the moment she'd gotten out of the airport taxi and stood before the new house on Westminster Crescent. The home she'd given up on the other side of the world would have new people by now. She imagined them unrolling leaves of newspaper to reveal objects that were important or fragile, but in truth were just links in a chain that lead you back to the beginning. No. She hadn't changed at all. She simply knew more because of all the things that had happened to her. And contrary to the fairy tales told to her at bedtime as a child, anything of value she'd returned home with was invisible to anyone but herself. After the taxi chugged back to Heathrow Airport, Helen had gone inside and dropped her luggage at the foot of the stairs. Like all houses, this place had its own smell that would disappear once she was used to it. On the hall floor beside her feet were letters addressed to someone she didn't know. She wondered about the people who'd been here before, tried to imagine their lives, but kept returning to the husband and son, now far beyond her reach. Still wearing her coat with the scent of aircraft cabin and coins forever loose in the seam, Helen walked through the kitchen and stood in the empty living room, stared out the front window. 100 times as a girl, she must have run, skipped, or ridden her clanking bike past this house. 100 times as a girl, without ever thinking it a place she would return one day to close her life in a perfect circle. On her 80th birthday, Helen spent the day moving things in the kitchen cupboard, wiping down shelves, vacuuming the stairs, turning from any face that appeared in the dust or the darkness between cans. 3 years pass with nothing to fill their pockets. And then early one morning, something happens. So that's the overture, and hopefully I stopped at just the right moment. So the book came about, I suppose, based on my own experience as a person, but also I think because of my deep friendship with a mouse. Now this didn't happen accidentally, but my daughter became a teenager, and if you've had teenagers, you'll know that there's an age where they sort of break up with you, and they don't really want to talk to you, tell you anything. They want to stay in their rooms with the door closed, and I mean, who knows what's going on in there. They put up strange colored lights, and it's like a Pink Floyd video. And anyway, so I said to my wife, it's a bit lonely now that Madeline's growing up, and so we got a goldfish. We got 2 goldfish, but one of them turned out to be a cannibal. And so we had 1 goldfish that lived about a year, and then was floating on her side. And I called the vet and said, I've got a goldfish, and they said, stop there. And apparently they don't see or treat fish. And but I did find an aquatic homeopath I know with the snake oil, I know it was a waste of money. But he said to put frozen pea in the fish tank every day at lunchtime and see what happens. And nothing happened. It just looked like soup. Tinkerbell was still living on her side. There were peas everywhere, and they were clogging the filtration system. And then eventually, my housekeeper called me one day when I was at work, and she said, "Tinkerbell dead, flush in toilet." And I didn't know if she had done it or she was asking me if she should do it. And as I'm a little frightened of her, I said, "Whatever you want, Barbara, whatever you want." And so 6 months passed, and I said to my wife, "Let's get another little friend." And she said, "What did you have in mind?" And I said, "Well, I was thinking maybe a rodent." And she said, "Well, take a bagel from the fridge, go down into the subway, and wait." And obviously I didn't do that because I don't like to share my bagels. But when the pandemic started, I convinced her that it would be a good idea for everybody's mental health if we had a pet mouse. And so I rushed out to Petco, I think on Long Island, and I found the last mouse, not on Earth, but within a few miles probably, and he was sitting in the tank, what's called a feeder tank, and it's an arena where snake owners will buy mice to feed to their snakes live, and which I feel was a bit Roman. It's a bit unfair, barbaric, in the sense, at least in nature, the mice have a chance to escape, or some kind of divine intervention. So the people who worked there were thrilled that I was buying this mouse as a pet. And he looked like he'd given up. He was sort of slumped over in a sort of mouse, just a pile of fur, and he looked extremely depressed. And so I bought him, I took him home, and my wife and I had already furnished this sort of mouse's dream palace. And it was an enormous sort of aquarium with an open top, and we'd read books on mouse care, and he had his very own wheel, and snacks, and a little snack station, a smoothie station. It was like a campus, actually. And it was sort of like the house mice of Orange County or something like that, And we put him in, and he sniffed around, and he was sort of a mouse, still a mouse at that point. And after a couple of weeks, I would go up to the tank and look in, and he would come and look at me through the glass. And I said to my wife one day, "I'm going in." And I rolled up my sleeve, and she said, "No, no, no." I thought you imagined I'd pull out like a bloody stump with like blood just spurting, but I put my arm in, and he jumped into my hand, and he ran up to my shoulder, and he just pressed his head against my neck. And from that point on, we really stopped treating him like a mouse, and we treated him like a person, because he felt like a person to us, somebody without language but capable of communication. Mice are nocturnal, but he adjusted his routine so that we could spend time together. He adjusted his sleeping habits to our work schedules. And in the evening, he would get his little smoothie and his midnight platter. And it's when you love an animal, it's a very special kind of relationship, I think. And a few weeks into having him, he had a breathing episode where he was gasping for air. And so it turns out, he had a terminal disease called Mycoplasma pulmonis, which is common in rodents, and there's no cure. And so I said to the vet, what are the options? And so we decided on a bronchodilator, sort of like albuterol, but for mice, and then an antibiotic, and he had to be fed these medicines twice a day with an oral syringe. I'd watched the King Kong movies. I knew how to hold. It was sort of like that. If King Kong had tried to give, an antibiotic to the woman. Do you remember that film from the 1940s? And so, but when you love an animal, when you love a pet, if the vet showed you a picture of the moon and said, the medicine your dog needs is here, you'd find a way of getting there. You'd text your husband, yeah, I'm at Google Space Station, 8,000 miles to go, you know what I mean? So when I had to work in Los Angeles during the pandemic for 6 weeks, I had to take, Tiresias was his name, I had to take him with me because, even though my wife loved him, he was really my mouse, And so we went on a road trip, and I rigged out the car so that the sun would never be beating down directly on his special enclosure, which I belted in the case of an accident. And so, we'd stop and we'd see the sights, and we saw a lot of interesting things, and we saw the Beatles carved into the rock face in North Dakota, and went out to California and watched the surfers. It was like Baywatch, but with a mouse. And then on the way back, he died in Las Vegas at the Wynn Casino. And I had him cremated and brought him home in a beautiful walnut box, which is now on my bookshelf. And so, when an author's writing a book, often what their passions are at that time will sort of leak into the work. So whenever I advise young writers, I tell them it's really easy to be a writer. All you have to do is be more yourself. You'll be defined in this world by what you're passionate about, more than anything else. If you can, so if you have an interest in marbles, or if you have an interest in, soil, whatever your interest is, just keep going, and just and eventually you'll see some sort of success. Because I suppose whatever we do, it's going to be very hard as a profession. So if we're interested in it, and we love it, and we're passionate and obsessed with it, then we're able to stomach all the work that's required. So I always say to students, whatever you're most passionate about, that's where you're going to have the most success. So that's easy. You don't have to do something you don't like, because you won't be very good at it. And you'll be competing with people who are passionate about that subject. And I remember, but the best answer to when somebody once said to a writer, I want to be a writer when I grow up. And the writer turned to them and said, can't do both, kid. That's my favorite answer to that question. After Tiresias died, my wife said to me one night, I'm finding it very difficult to sleep without the sound of a rodent in the next room. And I said, I think you're the only person in New York who's ever said that. And so we didn't want a rebound mouse. So we waited a few months, and then we went back to Petco, and we found Sipsworth. Now, he was being bullied by a bunch of other mice. I won't name names, but we know who they are. And they, my wife said, look, they won't even let him get a drink, not even a Sipsworth. And so we took him home, and we were experienced mouse carers at that point, and he was a wonderful, wonderful, very different personality from Tiresias. And he was really lively. He was social. Tiresias was a bit moody, and he liked his alone time. And he's in his little box listening to Joy Division, but Sipsworth was always wanted to be out playing. Always loved games. We bought him a little circus cannon, and somehow, instinctively, he knew how to shoot himself out of it. And then when he got old, he would just fall asleep in it. And whenever we sometimes it would creak as he sort of was breathing, and we'd hear this little creaking, and we'd see there's nothing like looking into a circus cannon and finding a mouse sleeping in it. And he lived over 2 years. There was a mouse that lived, I think, about 10 years, a lab mouse, who had the fortune or misfortune of being in longevity tests. CRISPR technology and things like that. So um, what's very interesting is that over 100 million mice are used in medical research every year. 100 million, just in the US alone, 100 million mice. And I know from experience that every mouse that I've met is capable of giving and receiving love. So it really is, I think, worth acknowledging the what mice have given us. I mean, if anyone you know is on statins or has had, surgery, I mean, the chances are people we love are alive today because of mice. So if you ever see a golden mouse statue outside a hospital, you'll know that I've won the New York State Lottery. Okay, so I'm going to read another little section. Helen is 83, and when I was in college, I always had to be earning money when I was younger. And so one of the jobs I took on was I worked in a nursing home, which I quickly learned is more a vocation than a job, because you quickly form you quickly form friendships with the people who live there, and those friendships can really nourish you for the rest of your life, And so what's interesting was the weather was also an inhabitant of the nursing home and was talked about constantly. People would stop. I'd be on some very important mission to deliver a baked potato to someone, and I'd be stopped in the hallway, and somebody would say, "Have you heard about the weather in Scotland?" "No, I haven't, Derek." "Well, it's very wet." And if there was a big storm coming, it was really the excitement of the day. Another influence was when I was a child, I had a paper route, and some of my clients, they lived in this sort of housing block. It was a little bit bleak, grey, concrete, post-war architecture, and there were about probably between 20 and 30 men of a certain age, 60 to 80, and all men, no women. And when I got to the door, in England, we don't have the pleasure of throwing a newspaper, which I imagine here is quite fun, because as a child, you want to hit things, So, but in the UK, we have to actually put the newspaper through an actual letterbox. So we have to get off our bicycles, trudge up, and as I would push the newspaper through the letterbox of these men's homes, the door would often open, and there would be this man standing there with polished shoes, corduroys, a sweater vest, usually a moustache, a tie, at 6 o'clock in the morning, with a pipe fully going, and the smell of bacon, leather, shoe polish, and smoke from the fire, which they'd also lit. And they would say, "There you are! Come on in then. It's cold out there. You want a nip of brandy?" And they'd try and give me alcohol. They would try and give me tobacco, and they would say, "Sit down. Get warm. Have you eaten?" And so I'd sometimes spend 10 or 15 minutes chatting with them as they opened the paper, and they'd always say the same thing: "Oh, ghastly, ghastly. What's going on with the world? The world's gone mad." They'd all pretty much, even whether some of them had conservative newspapers, some of them had more liberal newspapers, they'd all very different political tastes, but they were all just these wonderful men, and who were sort of funny but also kind, masculine but also gentle. And I always wondered about them. Who were they? And later on, with the internet, you can do anything. So later on, I did some research, and I found out that it was a government home for veterans of the RAF, the Air Force, for men who flew in D-Day. So they were Spitfire pilots from World War II, whose wives had died, who were alone, and had no money and needed government assistance. So just to think that, those men that I would deliver the newspaper to, were responsible for so much of the happiness in Britain at that time. Right, so as you can probably tell, elderly people have played an enormous part in my life, influencing me as a mentor. So Helen is sort of a blend of all the wonderful friendships I've had over the years. All right, so I'll read it from sort of the middle of the book. And let's see. So you'll know there's a mouse in the story. And Helen has brought the mouse in inadvertently, and she's deciding that she wants to get rid of it. So she goes out to the hardware store, and but this is a part where she's about to leave her house. I promise I wrote this book. Chapter 6. After the late morning weather forecast, Helen makes a decision. She puts on her hat, coat and shoes, still sticky from yesterday's rain. She can't have a rodent in the place. Absolutely not. No. The smell alone would be unbearable. She roots in the cupboard for the folding umbrella, snaps open her handbag to make sure everything is there, takes one final look in the sitting room where she's covered the fish tank with plastic film in case it tries to escape. The front door closes with its usual clap of the letterbox, but Helen hesitates on the doorstep, remembering again that time she tumbled into a well not properly filled in. For months after, fine grains of earth clung to her scalp. On the quick plummet down, her nose and mouth filled with soil, and the dark, so thick it was impossible to know if she'd gone blind. Oh, she cried out, of course, but each time her voice grew smaller and smaller until she was just a speck, then nothing beyond the churn of imagination, which placed her above like a wind, everywhere but invisible to the mother and father crunching the woods, casting their daughter's name into darkness like a small net. Members of the police and fire brigade combed forest and field until dusk. Then, with volunteers from the Veterans League and Teachers Union, they went all night on sugary tea and shared cigarettes. Her father had only been back a year from the war and was teaching again at the local school, hobbling the corridors with the help of a rubber-capped walking stick. Some of the children made fun of how he walked, imitating him on the playground to make themselves laugh and feel better about their own fathers, who lay at the bottom of the sea or in pieces somewhere, soon grown over. But the other children's words and actions didn't affect Helen. So many nights she'd lain still in her bed, begging God to bring her daddy home. She'd even offered her life in return for his. Deep in that wet stomach of earth, she wondered if this was the fulfillment of that bargain. She was finally rescued in the early hours of Friday morning with the help of a neighbor's dog that had been given something of hers to smell, an embroidered handkerchief. All the searchers had to do then was follow. Her mother had tried to feed the dog, but it wouldn't take anything until the child was found. Without knowing why, Helen fumbles for her keys and strides back into the house. From a drawer between the cooker and fridge, she takes a small cutting knife. Still buttoned into her coat, Helen carries the knife into the sitting room, where she pokes 6 quick holes in the plastic stretched tightly over the top of the fish tank. She expects to hear or see something, but the miniature world below is perfectly silent, as though the creature knows its life is finished and has accepted it. If you've read the book, you'll know that she ends up, sort of forming a bond with the creature. And now, since I wrote it, I've received quite a lot of mail from people who want to tell me their mouse stories. So the squeakquel might be other people's stories about mice. One of the most interesting was a woman who said she woke up one day and she found evidence of a mouse, chewed packets, fecal matter, and so because she'd read Sipsworth, she got one of those humane traps. It looks like a sort of a box that physicists will use to send you to another dimension, and but I promise you it's not that. And so you trap the mouse in this, and then you can release it somewhere. And so she got this, and a few nights later, she hears what sounds like, a Guns N' Roses concert happening inside the box, just bashing around it. And so she takes it outside to the wood pile, and the mouse just darts out, like a torpedo. And so great. But then there's another mouse, so she lays the trap again and traps another mouse and then takes it outside. And same thing, it zooms out. And then a few nights later, she can't believe this. She has an infestation of mice. So after about 10 or 15 times, she asks herself, could this be the same mouse? And so she takes some paint and she marks the mouse's tail. And now on release, it's not darting out anymore. Now it's just casually walking out of the thing and sitting on a log, and it looks at her, and then it wanders off. And then a few days later, it's back. And the box is she doesn't even know it's in there. It's sitting down, it's relaxed, and it's the same mouse. So she said, I don't know what I'm going to do. And because it thinks it's some sort of game. Anyway, she caught the mouse in the thing, and she took it to the wood pile, and it left, and it was raining, and it sort of was hesitant to leave the box, but it did, and it wandered off on its usual path. And then a few nights later, the box was empty, and she thought, with some sadness, the mouse has finally made a home outside, and she thought, well, maybe I'll go out and have a look. And when she went down to put her shoes on, the mouse was sitting in her heel, just waiting. I guess he didn't like being in the box anymore. So she put on another pair of shoes, and she took it out, and he hopped out cheerfully, wandered off. And a few nights later, he was back in her shoe. And I don't know what happened, but it's funny how, if you've ever had like a pet, you'll know that once you stop treating an animal the way that, treating an animal like an animal, it can really, and there's some scientific evidence to show that animals are capable of really much deeper relationships with us than maybe we previously thought. So anyway, I'll be happy to take any questions. That's code for think of a question. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. They don't have to be mouse related.
I know people have questions. I know Karen Nichter's going to have a question. There was one that came in on the feed here, which if I can get this to go. It's the question is, the book Night Came with Many Stars and the book Sipsworth are very different books. They're both feature strong female protagonists. Why did you choose to make the lead characters women And to what do you attribute your deft hand at writing from a woman's point of view?
Mm. Well, maybe having an Irish mother. That's a very good question. I don't really know. I mean, writing for me is a good question. It's really an instinctual process. My writing mentor, Barbara Wurzba, she said, sit down at the typewriter or the computer. She said, start typing and then get out of the way. And let the story, don't get in the way of the story. Let the story tell itself to you and write it down. Don't get between the typewriter and the story. You're the vessel. You're the medium for the work. And so, you know, I never really know what's going to happen until usually a page before it's due. I feel like writing requires an enormous amount of faith. You know, almost like driving in fog. You can only see a certain way, you know, and you have to have faith that you'll get safely to your destination and then everything will be all right. So I think that when younger writers or people who are starting off in writing, when they start working, I feel like their inner critic comes out much too quickly. I want at least 50 pages of mess before we start even thinking about what is a semicolon, and I'm not even sure I know now. But before the editing process starts, I'd like to see just pages and pages of just emotion and, you know, if crying, weeping, even pizza sauce on the pages are fine. So why do I write from the perspectives of women? I'm really not sure. And my agent once said, you know, you're in pretty dangerous territory here, you know, in America in 2024. But the fact is, I feel like, as Schopenhauer said, we can only do our will. We can't will our will. So really, I'm not sure what my next book is going to be about, until I really just sit down and start writing it. I have the same luck with deciding what to write as with deciding what to dream. So it really is I really heavily rely on instinct. So when people talk about that they like this book or that book, I say, oh, yeah, that is quite a good one. But meaning that, I mean, I don't have that much to do with it. And then when it goes off into the world, I'm here as the book's representative. But I feel like, you know, I start a book, but then the reader finishes the book. Because if I said, you know, the woman pulled up to the curb, got out of the car, and went around to the back door of the kitchen, went into the kitchen, across the kitchen floor to the refrigerator, she opened the refrigerator and took out some milk, everybody's imagining a different car, a different woman. Is it day or night? A different shoe, a different handle, a different fridge, a different kitchen, a different floor, and yet it was the same story. So it really is a kind of alchemy, I think, where the writer gives just enough for the reader to be able to enable a strange kind of autobiography to take place.
I think it was interesting as we talked through the day today to hear you talk a little bit about the different styles of writing that you've taken on. And I guess my question would be, okay, poetry, short stories, long fiction, stage plays, short movies. I know you also have an art background. Is there any of those that tend to draw you? Because I think a lot of writers establish a style that people get used to, and certainly bestsellers who sell crime novels and mystery novel series, you get repeat characters and things like that. Yet your writing tends to be lots of different things. Do you have any comment on why that may be?
That's a lovely question too. I suppose I follow my own advice of just doing what I find most interesting. So, my love and relationship with a mouse led to the book Sipsworth being written. There's nothing there's nothing the mouse does in the book that a real mouse can't do. And so I suppose also, being a writer who lives off his profession, I have to think about, when my daughter was getting older, I had to think about orthodontics, and there's all these, in life just keeps rising up to meet you. And so I thought to myself, well, I'm going to have to make a little bit of extra money here for this year or next year, so maybe I'll do a philosophy anthology or something like that. I mean, most people don't turn to philosophy when they need to make some extra money, but so I think living in New York, which is an incredibly expensive place to live as a writer, and wanting to have sort of a nice life, go on holidays and things like that, I've had to really just keep working and keep trying to explore new genres and avenues as a writer. I think if I'd bought Bitcoin instead of buying oil, I'm just kidding. If I didn't have to earn a living, I think that I would focus mostly on short stories and poetry.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Oh, there's a question up front here.
I have a question about the different genres. I was talking to another author recently, and she wrote in different genres, but she used a different name for the different genres. And this was at the request of her agent and her publisher, because they felt like if she used the same name for the different genres, that it would somehow dilute the sense that she is a certain type of writer. But you publish under your own name for all the different things. Did you receive any kind of pushback about that?
I did come up with a couple of pseudonym ideas, but one of them was Barney Milk, and another one was like Bingo Wentworth, and my agent just said, no, this is not going to work, because all your pseudonyms are ridiculous. So I thought they were fine. So we just did it under my names. But when younger writers ask about getting published, it really is so important that they're able to distinguish their voices as being different from their contemporaries. So for instance, there was a person who ran a foundation in Maine to give out money to musicians. And it was quite a lot. It was quite a nice purse. And so I said, how do you decide who gets the money, which young musician? And she said, oh, it's easy. She said, because most of what we get, the samples, she said, they're very good musicians. Sounds like, Glenn Gould playing the Goldberg Variations. This sounds like, Joan Baez. This sounds like the White Stripes. This sounds like, Otis Redding. She said, and then we get someone who doesn't sound like anybody. And maybe they don't play the guitar as well, and they're a bit sloppy, on the keyboard. But the sound and the tone and the style is so unique. She said they get the money. So I was talking to some young writers today, and I was advising them that the way to develop your voice and not to sound like anyone else, and to be able to write in many genres, is that happens, I think, by exposing oneself to as much diversity in art as possible, but not just art. I mean, in cooking, in every possible way, so that if somebody invites you to go see the exhibition of masks from Zimbabwe, go. If somebody says, let's go see the world's biggest potato masher, which I know you've seen, Eric, you should just throw everything down, tell your professors you have a family emergency, and go to see the world's biggest potato masher. Because then, when you're submitting your book among all the hundreds of books that are being submitted for publication, and the editors are talking, and one of them says, You know, I think it's really interesting how this author just uses a giant potato masher as one of the main, you see, so I think, you know, the big problems facing the, I think, younger generation are distraction, constantly being distracted by their phones, by people who have absolutely don't care an iota for their development as human beings. They simply want to make money from them. I think distraction is a big problem, and also the idea of everybody seeing the same thing, everybody watching the same shows, watching the same, you know, reading the same things. So I think I always say that you know, exploring diversity in every form. And when I see a student who comes to class, you know, wearing something absolutely bizarre, I'm always just so delighted, because they went to New Zealand and they were inspired by some sort of cloak they saw, and now they're wearing one. I always think that's wonderful, and I think that student has really a good future ahead of them. So writing in many genres, of course, I have a very diverse background myself, and I think that's contributed to that. So thank you very much.
Great. Do we have time for one last question?
Yeah, of course.
I knew Karen Dichter was going to have a question, so it's just a matter of time.
Yeah, what time's breakfast?
I know you said earlier that you have a balance in your life of writing, which is good for introverts, and then you do a lot of this. And I guess I just wonder, how much time do you need to devote to writing to turn out the books you write? I mean, what is the balance?
Well, I just don't spend too much time writing, actually, because what I've realized is that most creative people have a cup, and you know, and when that cup is empty, you're just imitating yourself. So I write Tuesday to Friday usually, from about 8 o'clock to noon, and about noon I know that the cup is empty. So if I keep writing, you know, I'll produce some work, but it'll probably be edited away later on in the process. So, but writing 4 mornings a week is enough to produce, you know, books. And what I realized early on in my career is that a publisher is willing to pay the same amount for a 200-page novel as they are for a 500-page novel. So, and I also like to keep my books short because I don't like to spend too long with characters. I can't imagine spending 5 to 10 years with the same people, you know, over and over again. The ending of the book actually was very different to the ending you have now. And my editor passed an early manuscript to Ann Patchett, who's over in Nashville, and she called my editor and said, "How open is Simon to criticism?" And my editor said, "Well, he's married, so very." And she said, "Well, you know, the ending's awful." And so he told me this, and I said, "Well, I'll rewrite it then." You know, I think when you're a younger writer, you become very attached to things because they're words and you put them there. But I think the older you get, you realize, look, they're just words. You can delete them and just write more. You know, you can just change things around. And so I rewrote the ending that we have now, and I think I avoided a lot of, well, she said I avoided like a disaster, which it was probably true because the ending was quite morbid, the original ending. So I hope it hasn't spoiled the ending for anyone who hasn't read it.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm sure if folks have additional questions, Simon would be only too happy to chat. He's also agreed to sign copies of the books that you have if you care to do that. And I think from now on we need to refer to you as Bingo Wentworth. I think that's a cool pseudonym, but maybe that's just me. But maybe you can put your hands together and thank Simon Van Booy.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, and I also want to present from us.
That's very kind of you.
And thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you. That's very sweet.
Yeah.